Good evening, everybody. Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone. My name's Ian Hampshire Monk and I'm Professor of Political Theory at the University of Exeter. Andrew has asked me to introduce him this evening, which I'm very happy, indeed honoured to do. I have a small announcement to make, which is to the effect that there is no practice fire alarm scheduled. So if the fire alarm goes off, we're to leave by the nearest Exeter and assemble opposite. I also have to say that I've never actually done this before, and it strikes me that the nearest thing to it is the best man's speech at a wedding, with the same opportunities for encomiums for your colleague and also impropriety, but I've been told I have to behave, so I shall. I'll say very few words about Sheffield, about politics, and about Andrew, and then I'll ask him to deliver his lecture. We'll have time for questions at the end, and then we'll move across the street for drinks. Sheffield politics professors are a very distinguished group, and it's been my privilege to work with a number of them. And in thinking about what I had to say today, I realised it would be 50 years ago this October that I started learning my trade under the inaugural Sheffield politics professor, Bernard Crick. So it's a particular pleasure for me not only to pay tribute to Andy, but also to my old university and its distinguished academy. The inaugural lecture is an important event in any academic's career. It's their opportunity to declare themselves to their colleagues and to characterise their sense of the subject. But it's also, in the nature of the occasion, an opportunity to speak to a wider public beyond the specialist academic world. And I think particularly for a politics academic, this bringing together of these two worlds is important. And how wonderful to do so in one's hometown before family and friends who I know are here today. So I first met Andrew when we were wise enough to appoint him as a colleague at Exeter. And his post, British Politics and Public Administration, was very far removed from my area, the history of political thought. But I was very quickly aware that he had wide interests which overlapped at the margins with mine and those of many others in the department. And one of the things about Andrew, as I'm sure many of his colleagues will know, is that he has an uninhibited and probing intelligence. So he's never afraid to ask the question which, whilst it might risk seeming naive, is likely to successfully challenge the kind of defences that academia's little groups build up around themselves. And this is intellectually bracing, and it enables him to engage across a department. The academic study of politics, as undergraduates discover often to their surprise, is a very strange and disparate subject area, including as it does histories, national, institutional and intellectual, anthropologies, philosophy, and both qualitative and quantitative social science. And nowadays, when young scholars are early and increasingly pressured into narrow specialisation, a colleague with wide interests and competences such as Andrew is a great gift. They're the intellectual brokers that help connect these disparate studies. And when that scholarly breadth is allied to personal qualities that are inclusive and collegial, then that value is reinforced. A successful department is a social one as well as an intellectual one, and this was the contribution that Andrew made at Exeter, and I know also at Sheffield. You're fortunate to have him, but I also know that the Sheffield department has had a long commitment to embracing the diversity of our subject. So he's also come to the right place. At Exeter, we not only benefited from Andrew as an academic, but shortly after he arrived at Exeter, we underwent the double whammy of a heavy-duty QAA visitation and an RAE in the same year, for those of you who can remember what they were. I was, I think it's fair to say, an extremely administratively challenged head of department. And I was hugely indebted to his support and commitment during that long year. It's always seemed to me paradoxical that someone who subscribed to a rational, self-interested model of human decision-making should constantly contradict it in the generosity of his own personal and professional life. Andrew's not only a terrific academic, but a really good and steadfast friend, and he combines these two roles through being a consistently provocative source of thinking and discussion. In most years that I've known him, Andrew has arranged a short annual hill walking holiday for myself and Keith Zimmerman, who is here tonight as well. These expeditions involved arduous and sometimes perilous outings. Indeed, the weather forecast for our visit to Skye contained the word ferocious. It's the only time I've ever seen it used in a meteorological context. But the walks were not only physically demanding, they involved serious academic discussions, some at least of which have resulted in published papers. So thanks to Andy, the major issues of recent politics are etched in my mind onto the mountain topography of Britain, the Lake District and New Labour, the Cullen Ridge and the crisis of capitalism, Brexit, of course, and the Brecon Beacons. This link between walking and intellectual discussion, of course, has a long history. It starts with Aristotle, who, in contrast to Plato, would reputedly teach whilst walking around. And it's not only through the walking, I think, that Andrew is more of an heir to Aristotle than of Plato. Petrarch, too, was a famous intellectual hill climber, writing an essay on his ascent of Mount Ventoux, in which he reflected on the nature of the human condition. And walking was also a foundational practice of your first chair, Bernard Crick, who would hold his seminars on the moorland around Sheffield. Aristotle, Petrarch, Crick, Hindmoor. So no pressure, Andrew.
Thank you very much. You'll have to pause whilst I learn how to operate the stopwatch again on my phone, which last time I did it at the Sperry Away Day caused no end of amusement. I will time myself. Thank you, Ian, and thanks everyone for sacrificing their time this evening to attend. I decided 6 months ago that I'd like to deliver a delayed inaugural lecture as a way of marking, in a few months' time, the launch of a new book, 12 Days, The Making of Modern Britain, which I'm also using as the core text for a first-year British politics course I'm teaching with Amy Smith that we started just the other week. 12 Days is a history of modern Britain related by way of a dozen miniature histories of a dozen days in British history, starting with the 1976 Labour Party conference and finishing in 2017 with the parliamentary vote to trigger Article 50. I'm going to touch upon some of the events I talk about in that book tonight. Most notably the miners' strike, the murder of Stephen Lawrence, the financial crash, and of course Brexit. But beyond that, and running with the theme of the book, I'm going to introduce you in something approaching chronological order to 12 people who have left their marks upon my thinking or upon my career. I don't think there is necessarily a conventional format for an inaugural lecture, but one tried, tested and successful approach is to talk about the research you have done, the research you want to do, and to extract from this some common themes. I will do some of this tonight, but I will also try more broadly to talk about contemporary politics, the nature of politics as an activity and as a field of study, the teaching of politics, and the identity and role of university politics departments, including on occasions the one in this university. Insofar as there is a common theme, it emerges, I hope, in the things I say about human fallibility, my own very much included, compromise and the principle of pluralism. My chosen 12 feature 3 academics I've worked with, 1 academic I've not met but whose work stayed with me, 1 singer, 1 civil rights activist, 1 reigning monarch, 2 former bank CEOs, 1 former UKIP leader, and, in my opening slide, 1 former Prime Minister and 1 former trade union leader. The miners' strike began on the 6th of March 1984, a few weeks before my 15th birthday. It lasted for 3 days short of a calendar year. Sheffield, my home, then as now, was in the eye of this storm, a steel town 30 miles to the north of the Mansfield mines in which my granddad had worked, and 20 miles south of the Barnsley mines where my uncles and cousins were still working. And you could make a good case that the decisive moment in the strike came in June 1984, when 5,000 miners were ferociously beaten back and beaten by 6,000 police at the Orgreave coking plant on the site of what is now, in a postmodern ironic twist, the university's Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre. It is difficult to convey, for those who weren't there, just how feral politics was at this time, the degree to which the strike pulled people apart, polarised identities and fuelled a sense of palpable rage. And it left me, at a tender age, an instinctive centrist at a time when it felt that the centre was being pulled apart and that compromise, the precondition for effective democratic politics, was being framed as a political sin. The miners' strike then, as Brexit is today, became an existential issue about national identity and, in the minds of its protagonists, survival. But it nevertheless remained an issue where compromise was always possible. Indeed, as the biographies have been written and the archives opened, we now know there were perhaps 4 or 5 occasions when a compromise might and perhaps should have been agreed. Yet as soon as the outline of a deal was on the table, it was scorched by one or both of our 2 protagonists. Margaret Thatcher and Arthur Scargill were 2 leaders who were adamantly convinced that their position was manifestly and self-evidently right, that their opponent in the contest was an enemy of the people and of the country, and that compromise would not simply be politically unwise, but cowardly and morally wrong. The lesson I imbued is this: beware in politics those who are possessed of an absolute conviction of their rightness, which stretches to moral contempt for their opponents. In the liberal philosophical tradition we today most readily associate with John Rawls, there is an attempt to conjure compromise and toleration out of reasoned argument from premises that it is open to everyone to accept. This effort has always struck me as worthy but emotionally disemboweled. The surer footing on which to ground the possibility and political virtue of compromise is not the reach of our reason, but an awareness of its limit and a corresponding sense of humility. History, our own personal histories, as well as the history of the ideas, parties and politicians we study, tell us that we get things wrong, and that other people, including Margaret Thatcher and Arthur Scargill, also get things wrong. I know that compromise is hard to defend as a first-order political principle, and that my own centrist dadism is easy to parody as a political philosophy. But it also strikes me that times and places in which politics is conducted in the absence of a willingness to compromise, and that was one of them, and this is now one of them, the course of history tends to run badly. I was wrong, horrifically wrong, about the Iraq War. I'm looking at Keith because we sat on the pub during our big debate, which as history has turned out probably wasn't our best night in the pub. And I'll pick up on 2 other issues tonight, one of them next, where I think I've got other important things significantly wrong. But the experience of being so steadfastly mistaken has left me, if nothing else, with a wariness of steadfast conviction, mine or of others, and a wariness of choices framed in zero-sum terms as requiring winners or losers and demanding that people be prophets or fools. So to my second slide, the Bard of Barking. My habit of seeing in ABBA's lyrics a unique insight into the human condition is a relatively recent one. Growing up, it was Billy Bragg I listened to and whose promotional T-shirts I wore. And although the T-shirts faded and were eventually lost, Billy Bragg serves as a good reminder to me, if no one else, that the particular centrism I feel attached to is a left-of-centre social democracy which seeks, sometimes awkwardly, to position itself between and to avoid being run over by the much clearer but less tempered alternatives of socialism and what gets called neoliberalism. I wrote a book last year called What's Left Now, which might be summarised as consisting of a 200-page moan about the left's habit of moaning about things, and in particular its habit of moaning about and dismissing out of hand everything and everyone associated with New Labour. And on this point, I still stand. I find the left's habit of condemning without qualification anything actually done by the left when it is in government nihilistic, especially so when the denouncements are offered by politicians, political commentators or academics who have precisely zero experience of governing and of the setbacks, mistakes, betrayals and inconsistencies that governing in the development and implementation of public policy inevitably entails. And for what it is worth, and to bang on an old Downsian drum, I do still think that electability is one virtue of an opposition, and that there are, a few years on from the last election, still at the margins reasonable doubts about the electability of this Labour opposition, which in most opinion polls currently trails far behind a Conservative government setting new standards for incompetence and division. A lot of you would have expected me to say that, and will be relieved to learn that I have edited down my initial rant to just a few lines. So let me say something a little bit more unexpected. A few years ago, my other objection to Corbynism was that it was pretty much a policy black hole, and that, within the Labour Party, slogans were being preferred to the hard yards of actually developing and road-testing public policy. This has started to change. On some issues, including housing, the policy issue I care most about, the Labour Party, influenced, I would hope, by the IPPR's Economic Commission on Social Justice, chaired by our own Michael Jacobs, has actually started to outline some substantive and I think impressive policy positions which have the potential to appeal to different parts of the left in the way, lest we forget, that Tony Blair's policies, such as the minimum wage, once did in the 1990s. In 1982, a young, aspiring, wannabe Labour activist who had just been defeated in a by-election in Beaconsfield was invited to Perth to give a lecture on the state of British politics. Although already associated with the right of the party, the lecturer argued that the right of his party had become too timid, too fuzzy, and, as he put it, too used to basking in the praise of the leader writers of the Financial Times and the Guardian. He went on to argue that, having been thrown into opposition in 1979, the right of the Labour Party had failed to renew itself, and that, and I quote, "The left has generated an enormous amount of quite necessary rethinking in the party, some of which," he added, "ought to be of appeal across the party." A year later, the lecturer became MP for Sedgefield, and just over a decade after that, the leader of the Labour Party, and the rest, they say, is history. But looking back to this now obscure lecture, it strikes me that the analysis is actually quite a reasonable one. Getting elected matters, but feasible and thought-through policy solutions matter more. And in fits and starts, the new Labour leadership is helping the process of putting good left-of-centre policy ideas on the table. I don't think I'm likely to spend my next few years wandering music festivals wearing Jezza t-shirts. But on this issue, I have started to soften. And I'm sure if he knew this, Billy Bragg, a cautious proponent of Corbynism, would be happy and would think that he did, after all, make a difference to me, beyond filling my teenage head with unrequited love songs. I now want to shift gear and talk about three academics who've had a significant impact upon the early stages of my career. The first, who I met when he was a lecturer in the Department of Government at Brunel University, but is now Distinguished Professor of Politics at the Australian National University, is Keith Dowling. Keith was my PhD supervisor and more recently my collaborator on the Australian Policy Agendas project, and he was also the person who introduced me to rational choice theory, about which I will say more presently. But the reason Keith remains in many respects my academic idol relates to the breadth of his research interests and his instinctive academic pluralism. Keith is one of the very few people in the profession who can publish top-notch papers on political theory and papers using large N statistics and do so at the same time. Keith's pluralism is grounded in a basic judgment that good academic work comes from asking interesting and varied questions, and that there is no reason to think that particular theories or methods are always going to be particularly well suited to answering any particular question. Pluralism matters at a departmental level. Politics departments, the best departments, teach a wide variety of subjects in a variety of different ways. But in my view, and I recognise that this is not a position everyone shares or necessarily ought to share, pluralism is also a virtue in individual researchers. The observation I would make here is that today, unfortunately, this kind of pluralist research emerges despite and not because of the institutional environment in which our PhD students are trained. The old, and I think increasingly old-fashioned idea that a PhD ought to be focused upon the completion of an 80,000-word thesis on a tightly defined topic has, over the last decade or more, combined with the growing pressure to complete a thesis within 3 years and to publish peer-reviewed work whilst doing so, to narrow, sometimes drastically, the academic breadth of the researchers that we train. It is hard to imagine a supervisor now being able to tell a student, as Keith was able to tell me, to just read and think about things for the first year of their PhD. Instead, we push students to focus immediately upon a narrow research topic and to then stick to it and to publish on it at the expense, all too often, I would suggest, of a breadth of learning about the discipline as a whole. The journal I co-edit, Political Studies, has a long-standing editorial policy of publishing papers from different theoretical and methodological traditions, so long as the authors of those articles try to speak to the academic discipline of politics as a whole, rather than to simply one set of colleagues occupying a subdisciplinary niche within it. I'm really proud of the journal and of the opportunity to work with Matt, Hayley and Charles, none of whom are here tonight, but I'll say it anyway. But I would add that it is, to my mind, a somewhat worrying state of affairs when a commitment to this kind of pluralism might be thought of as the USP for an academic journal about politics. It should be the normal, and it is not, and I have to say that really bothers me about our discipline. This is an inaugural lecture, and surrounded by family, friends and colleagues who have never once disagreed with me about anything, I can venture to be slightly opinionated, so I will pursue this point further. A few months into my PhD, I became interested in a body of now largely forgotten academic work on what was called market socialism. The details don't matter. What matters looking back was Keith Dowling's advice, that before I could say anything about markets, I needed to read and think about not only what socialists had to say about markets, but what the right-wing opponents of socialism, and in particular Friedrich von Hayek, said about markets. And when asked which bits of Hayek I should read, Keith indicated that the collective works of Hayek would be a good starting point. Hayek once said that if socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists. I don't agree, and just for the record, I'm not Hayekian, and I'll explain why in a few slides' time. But in the 1930s, long before the calamity of the road to serfdom, Hayek wrote a series of incredibly important essays on knowledge and markets. And I thought then, and still think now, that anyone who wants to study political economy or social justice should read Hayek carefully and think long and hard about what he says. And of course, many academics do exactly that, including, to take just one example, Andrew Gamble, who wrote a brilliant book on Hayek called The Iron Cage of Liberty, which was published just as I was finishing my PhD. And I wouldn't have had to have read the collected works of Hayek if you'd published it a little bit quicker, Andrew. But I can't help but notice that within the echo chamber of academic journals, many parts of the left have stopped bothering to engage with Hayek and other figures on the right, preferring, instead, to hand down caricatures of their arguments, wrapped in the catch-all, debate-ending, rhetorical wrapper of neoliberalism, safe in the knowledge that as long as your primary audience is composed of people who already agree with you, that you don't actually have to do the tough work of forensically picking apart your opponent in the way that Andrew once did. You get 280 characters on a tweet, and it's hardly surprising that Twitter lends itself to an abundance of ardour and an absence of nuance. You get 8,000 words for an academic article, and I find it faintly disturbing when, as happens much too often, I know exactly what is going to be argued in a paper and what the conclusion is that's going to be drawn and why, after reading little more than the opening lines of a piece. There is a wave of irony about to crash over me, a non-nuanced attack on a lack of nuance in academia by an academic who somehow always manages to extract from any problem a middle-of-the-road solution, and whose track record of being radical and transgressive amounts to an unfortunate incident last December when I arrived at University Senate late and wearing my Christmas elf jumper, only to realise I've spectacularly misjudged the mood of the room. And when I tried to take it off, it was covered in bells and they started to jangle. And everyone started to turn and look at me including the Provost Professor Jill Valentine, who gave me what can only be described as a bit of a death stare. But if I am all too often incapable of original and unexpected thought, I would at least hope to take solace in the capacity of other academics to do so. And I think, as a discipline, that we collectively sometimes fall short in this respect. Just to be clear, I don't mind people being political when they write about politics. We need to be careful when we teach, not to teach students what to think, or to leave them thinking that some positions will be better received than others. But we are here to be critical, and being critical means being political. But being critical also means trying to say different and sometimes unexpected things in different ways. It means not just reheating the same arguments and relying upon ritual denunciations of figures like Hayek. I met Ian when I was appointed, as he said, to a lectureship at the University of Exeter in 1996, and I've ever since benefited from his company and the generosity of his advice. The three of us, Ian, myself and my good friend Keith, who's also here tonight, together with Luke the Labrador, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago, are pictured here in 2013, Ian's already referenced it, outside the Sklygachen Hotel on the Isle of Skye, getting ready to walk towards the cloud-covered Coolan Main Range in the background. Ian, as I recall it, had an incredibly sore knee, having fallen over the day before. Although he was probably feeling a little bit better than the time a few years before, walking on the moors near Glencoe, when, scrambling up a slope, I dislodged a rock which fell on his head, and when challenged by Ian about it, excused my lack of care by observing that it had, all things being considered, been a relatively small rock. Ian is an historian of political thought who slowly but surely encouraged me to engage with, in particular, Quentin Skinner's work on how political philosophers are both constrained by and operate within, but can nevertheless strategically deploy language and concepts. I'll come back to the art of the history of political thought when I talk about the financial crisis. But for now, I want to note that when I arrived in Exeter, I arrived as a rational choice theorist. For those who don't know, rational choice is the name given to the attempt to apply the methods of formal economics, the assumptions of rationality and self-interest combined with formal modelling to the study of politics. Today, and at least within British politics departments, rational choice theory stands largely as a testimony to the poor taste of previous generations. But in the early 1990s, rational choice theory provoked strong opinions whilst carrying around it a certain kind of intellectual aura and a sense of having the future on its side. I can now nevertheless confirm that rational choice theory is wrong. It is sometimes wrong in interesting ways, but it is wrong nevertheless. Ian and I have only ever published one paper together called, ironically, given our previous adventures, Between a Rock and a Hard Place. But it proved to be an important one for me in recognising this. The argument in the paper, a straight application of Ian's work as an historian, was that in order to explain people's actions, you need to work backwards and identify and track the reasons which stand behind those actions. And that rational choice theory, instead of doing this, either pays no attention to what people actually think or offers fantastical just so stories about what they think that do not actually count as evidence. The point, said out loud like this, seems entirely obvious, but I guess I have a history here of missing the obvious, and Ian is one of many people who have helped me to correct that tendency. I've always worked in social science faculties, and I'm particularly happy to do so in Sheffield because our faculty is so strong, and I also have to say incredibly well led. But in the end, politics is, as a subject, a humanity, which studies, albeit in methodologically varied ways, a particular and particularly difficult aspect of human society and culture. I now want to slightly reverse my chronology. Stephen Lawrence was brutally murdered on the 22nd of April 1993 by racist thugs whilst he and a friend were waiting to catch a bus home. Looking back, Stephen's murder feels like a seminal moment in recent British history. But what we risk forgetting is that for a long time the murder, although never entirely forgotten, was precariously placed, with the media, the police and the government expressing only intermittent interest in it. The story of how this changed is, in large part, a story of how Stephen's mother, Doreen, now Baroness Lawrence of Clarendon, refused to be fobbed off by the police and kept asking searching and awkward questions. Doreen Lawrence was, At the time of Stephen's murder, a teacher for children with special needs who was studying for a humanities degree at Greenwich University. She is, in my view, about as close to a hero as we get in Britain today. But the story of Stephen Lawrence's murder is also a story about party politics and government. As I've already said, and as left to my own devices tend to say every 10 minutes or so, I find it endlessly frustrating that the weight of the academic discourse around neoliberalism bulldozes out of its path any recognition of the ways in which, after 18 years of Conservative government, the Labour government elected in 1997 made possible political conversations and decisions which had previously seemed unthinkable. This is one such example. Doreen Lawrence had fought hard to secure some measure of justice for her son since the day he was murdered. But looking back, the key moment in this story comes with the decision taken in July 1997 by the new Labour Home Secretary, Jack Straw, to establish a public inquiry into Stephen's murder after years in which his Conservative predecessor, Michael Howard, had even refused to meet with his mother. In What's Left Now, I try to assemble a long set of statistics about the differences New Labour made. I know that numbers can get boring, and I know that I can get particularly boring when I recite them, but the numbers matter. It matters that between 2000 and 2010, real public health expenditure adjusted for inflation increased by 75% and public education expenditure by 57%. It matters that income inequality not only stopped growing but fell. It matters that the estimated number of people sleeping rough in England fell by 90% between 1998 and 2010. And I want to weep with frustration and anger when you can see how, just walking around Sheffield today, these achievements have been reversed and how many people are now sleeping rough. You see more people every week, and it is just unnecessary, and it makes me want to be an 18-year-old socialist revolutionary. I just think we're just throwing away so much there. But I think if I were to start to write What's Left again, I would focus less on the numbers and more on stories like that of Doreen Lawrence to illustrate why I remain convinced that New Labour was, at least in terms of its domestic policy agenda, an often positive force for the good, and why the view that New Labour did nothing and was simply a different shade of neoliberalism continues to irk me to this day. I first met Steve Bell in 2001 during a sabbatical visit to Australia when he became head of school and offered me a position at the University of Queensland. A few years later, I packed my bags and left Exeter behind. Steve and I have written 2 books together and developed the enjoyable habit, as I also have with Ian, of thinking about talking about politics whilst trekking, sometimes in the Queensland sun and sometimes in the snow and ice. But despite the fact that Steve and I have written so much together, the one lesson above all I've taken from Steve is about the importance of teaching. Steve is not by any stretch of the imagination a flash teacher. He has several times had to ask me to explain PowerPoint to him and favours long silences in tutorials as a pedagogic technique. But when he was head of department at Queensland, he was always completely clear about the importance of teaching and the need to ensure that students, all students, good and bad, lazy and hardworking, felt that they were the reasons the department existed. Over the last quarter of a century, the REF has been the making of the politics department at Sheffield. Leaders like Tony Payne and Andrew Gamble saw in it the opportunity to take a small provincial department and to turn it into one of the largest and best politics departments in the country. LSE, Oxford and King's get the name recognition outside of academia, but if you work in a politics department in the UK, you will know that Sheffield beats them hands down. We are, right now, approaching the end of another REF cycle, and I hope at the end of it that we emerge once again at or very close to being the top of this particular tree, not least because otherwise Craig will want to talk to me. Because doing well in the REF does hugely matter. It brings some additional money, but above all it brings better students, a reputation which allows us to attract the very best academics. But at the same time, and looking across the sector as a whole, it feels to me that the REF, which was being run for the first time just as I was starting my career, has also done harm. It has not simply unbalanced the relationship between research and teaching, but in too many departments rendered it antagonistic by further loading the incentives and promotion structures towards the former and away from the latter. I don't want to believe that the REF's alphabetical successor, TEF, is the best way of now achieving that right balance. Supplementing one government-imposed wonky metric with another government-imposed wonky metric does not sound ideal. But the TEF does rely heavily upon NSS data that tells us what students think about what we teach them and how we teach, and the TEF is leading lots of departments, not just the politics department here, to look at and focus again upon teaching. As the head of a department, the TEF fills me with something approaching a cold dread. But as the father of a baby boy, little Jordan, who left home last week to go on a 5-month gap year holiday to Australia before going to university in September to study international relations, I have to say that I think of the TEF somewhat differently and perhaps even a little bit more positively. In this context, and whilst talking about teaching, I will also add on a further personal note that I regret the degree to which, over the last decade, I have undoubtedly focused upon research, coasted through my own teaching, and not done enough to learn from and emulate colleagues at the start of their careers, including two good friends, Jamie and Liam, who bring to the table not only great research ideas, but new ideas about and a steadfast commitment to teaching. It gets harder as you get older to teach with quite the same enthusiasm that you did when you started. And it gets harder to engage with students when you're just yet another middle-aged male professor called Andrew. But as and when I go back to teaching, I want to spend more time not simply saying that this is so, but finding ways around it. I continue to believe that academics can contribute significantly to public debate as researchers, and that the case studies we are preparing in the department and in Sperry, as a part of our REF process, show just how significant the impact of our research can be. But good teaching by researched, engaged academics is how we transform lives. On the 13th of September 2007, the BBC reported that the Northern Rock Bank was in trouble, sat 16,000 kilometres away in Australia. I'm not sure whether I can remember noticing. I was probably on a beach. But when, a year later, Lehman Brothers collapsed, Steve and I decided that we'd better stop writing about governance and instead start writing about banking and finance. And there are two people now I want to introduce you to. The first, Charles Chuck Prince, the former CEO of Citigroup, said in July 2007, just as the crisis was gathering pace, when the music stops, in terms of liquidity, things will be complicated, but as long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance. This, I think, captures an important truth about the causes of the crisis. In the 1980s, neoliberal governments in the UK, US and Australia deregulated and sought to make their banking sectors more competitive. And given the easy profits the banks were making at the time, it was difficult to argue with this policy intention. But it turns out that there can be markets in vice as well as markets in virtue, and that competition can do economic harm as well as good. By the early 2000s, the pressure on banks to record ever higher pre-tax profits and to engage in high-risk trading put an incredible pressure upon the banks. The banking sector found itself caught in an arms race in which bank executives, if they refused to engage in high-risk activity, were removed from the game by irate shareholders. This was not a world in which caution paid off, and because it did not pay off, the risk kept growing until eventually boom gave way to bust. Greater competition is indeed the answer sometimes to some problems, but it is not the answer to all problems, and it is sometimes an answer which causes new problems. And that, incidentally, and as promised, is one of the reasons why I'm not a Hayekian. My second picture is of Dick Fuld, the executive who ran Lehman Brothers as a personal fiefdom and eventually ran the bank into the ground. Fuld was the embodiment of the kind of imperious, tough-talking, master-of-the-universe boss who became the managerial norm in Wall Street and the City of London. When, in 2005, a senior risk manager raised concern with Fuld about Lehman's risk exposures, Fuld took this as a threat to his authority, sacked the manager and a large part of that manager's team. He was not, by all accounts, a nice guy. I've already spoken of pluralism as an academic virtue. But of course, pluralism is also a political principle, a commitment to the constraint of unbridled political power, and Lehman Brothers stands to my mind as a pretty powerful symbol of the costs of unpluralism, an important and often overlooked cause of the financial crisis. Organisations, whether they be profit-maximising global banks, political parties, sports teams, or even academic departments, are much more likely to work more effectively if the authority to make decisions is diffused across a number of people, or, insofar as it is concentrated in the hands of a particular person, is still open to being discussed and challenged in circumstances in which complete silence in a meeting is not confused for agreement. Nearly there. In November 2009, during a tour to mark the opening of a new building at the LSE, the Queen famously asked of the financial crisis, why did nobody see it coming? A question I took as a title for a paper I wrote a few years later on crises and lesson learning. Looking back with the benefit of considerable hindsight, the jaw-dropping flaws in the financial system look so staggeringly obvious that it is genuinely hard to see why they were not seen at the time. One answer here is that they were not seen because highly paid bankers found it in their willful interest not to see them. But while self-interest, that is to say rational choice, is a part of this story, it is not the whole story. Historians of political thought like Ian labour to reconstruct the intellectual and political context in which philosophers operated to show us what they could and could not have been thinking and trying to do with their words. And when it comes to doing this for Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, we instinctively recognise how hard the task is. But one lesson for me of a decade spent looking at and thinking about the financial crisis is that it is also surprisingly hard, indeed perhaps given the immediacy of hindsight at play, particularly hard, to reconstruct what it is that people were thinking when the events they were thinking about are in the recent past. To understand what went wrong with the financial system in the 2000s, we need to understand what people were thinking, and in particular, why they thought the system they had created was safe. One resulting story here, which fits with the theme of my lecture about the limits of human reason, is about the propensity to make mistakes and the virtues of caution and humility. During the boom year, bank executives, regulators, risk managers and credit rating agencies did not understand how the system they had collectively established worked. They did not see how by securitising assets they had in fact shared and so multiplied risks. They did not imagine how liquidity might freeze, morphing what ought to have been a manageable subprime downturn into a global crisis. And they did not see how, in a large end system, risk is a subjective state rather than an objective probability, and how overconfidence could give way to overreaction and blind panic. In this sense, the history of the crisis is a history of how people who thought they were really clever all came to think the same things and the wrong things at the same time, which is the human condition. So to my final slide. I said that the reason I wanted to give a delayed inaugural lecture was to launch a new book. But the other reason for doing so was that it struck me as a good opportunity to reflect upon an academic career on the eve of my 50th birthday. A personal landmark which now feels more inevitable and even less desirable than Britain's exit from the European Union, scheduled for the 29th of March, one day after my birthday. So the final slide had to be of Nigel Farage. One of the oddities about Brexit is that it already seems very hard to say anything new about something which has not yet even happened. My own lack of nuance means you can probably predict what I'm going to say about Brexit, so I will say it quickly. Effective politics is about compromises and finding solutions with which everyone can live. For a long time, Britain found such a compromise in relation to its membership of the European Union. For 30 years, we performed the hokey-cokey of having one foot in and one foot out, accepting the basic terms, advantages and occasional indignities of membership, whilst also steadfastly rejecting federalism, monetary union, speaking a foreign language or any hint of enthusiasm. That compromise was awkward, occasionally embarrassing, and very easy to satirise by those who wanted a whole lot more of Europe or a whole lot less. But the compromise kind of worked and kind of reflected the balance of public opinion. That compromise was put on notice when David Cameron, for reasons of internal Conservative Party management, promised a referendum in which compromise, awkwardness and ambiguity was reduced to the empty vessels of in or out. Compromise was then squeezed further by a referendum campaign in which the two sides were led to make and respond to ever more extreme and unbalanced arguments. Finally, compromise was then hit over the head with a brick by a Prime Minister who interpreted a 52-48 result as precluding even the possibility of listening to and compromising with anyone who had voted to remain. It's difficult right now at least to see how this can be put back together. It's difficult because on the one side, hard Brexiteers seem determined not to compromise, a position underpinned by a conviction that the public will on this issue has been revealed and settled, and as a result that any outcome other than full Brexit lacks legitimacy. But it is also difficult because on the other side, me, and I'm guessing for the most part us, and we, decided a long time ago that the referendum result was not simply the wrong result, but an illegitimate result, insofar as it was the result of lying, manipulation, and the dog whistle politics of xenophobia, if not at times outright racism. And up to a point, I sympathise. The referendum campaign was a good reminder of why periodic general elections to select a government with parties and manifestos are actually quite a good idea, and why any notion of there being such a thing as the public will, let alone a settled public will on an issue, is a nonsense. But like it or not, 2 years on, public opinion is still fundamentally split on Europe, and it is palpably inadequate for us, we, to simply sit back and say that Remainers are ignorant, deluded, or beyond the moral pale. At this point, in other words, it strikes me that the need for compromise cuts in both directions. This is, however, easier said than done. The problem is not simply that parliamentary sovereignty has now, on this issue, been irretrievably compromised by the outcome of a popular referendum. The problem is not even that this Parliament is deadlocked. The problem is that Parliament is spectacularly ill-suited in its current form to search for or build momentum behind compromise solutions of the sort I unexpectedly have to say Jeremy Corbyn has recently outlined. My inclination towards compromise is, as always, a pretty weak first-order political principle. But compromise over Brexit might, to paraphrase Churchill, be the worst possible outcome with the exception of all the other possible outcomes. To go back to where I started, this is, for me, the lasting lesson of the miners' strike. Total victory, the kind of victory secured by Margaret Thatcher in the miners' strike, does not in the end dissolve divisions. It simply congeals them. Total victory for Remain or Leave will, I worry, have the same consequence. I've completed my dozen and run out of time, and I will stop. I'd like to thank Ian once again for travelling up to Sheffield to introduce me, and to all of you for listening. So intent am I on the pursuit of a career in middle-level neoliberal management that it feels like a long time since I've actually done any thinking, let alone any actual research. But I hope that you are all far too polite to say so during your questions. Thank you.